Leo Martinez was dying alone. The doctors said the cancer had spread and he had 2 weeks left. The 67-year-old man had no family visiting him at the hospice. Just a Virgin Mary statue he'd saved from earthquake rubble sitting by his bed. It was the same statue his late wife used to pray to every day. On his 3rd night, Leo woke up to something impossible. The statue was glowing with a soft light. All his pain was gone. The next morning, doctors ran new tests. The cancer had completely disappeared. They had no explanation. Leo knew it was a miracle. But was this really the end of the story or just the beginning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months before the miracle, Leo Martinez sat in his kitchen, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the empty chair where his wife used to drink her coffee. The ceramic mug with the faded roses still sat in the same spot on the counter where Maria had left it 3 years ago. He couldn't bring himself to move it. At 67, Leo carried himself with the steady posture of a man who had spent 30 years running toward fires while others ran away. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades of rescue work, now had little to do besides turn the pages of yesterday's newspaper and tend to a garden that Maria had once filled with lavender and tomatoes. The lavender still bloomed each spring, but the tomatoes had given way to weeds. San Rafael, California, had been home for 42 years. It was the kind of town where neighbors still waved from their front porches, and the local diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The population had grown from 8,000 to nearly 15,000 since Leo and Maria had first moved there as newlyweds. But it still maintained that small-town rhythm where everyone knew everyone else's business, usually before they knew it themselves. Leo's house on Maple Street was a modest 2-story with white shutters that Maria had insisted on painting blue every 3 years. They were white now, had been for 4 years, and would likely stay that way. The front garden that had once burst with color now displayed a careful arrangement of low-maintenance shrubs that required little attention. Neighbors had offered to help, but Leo preferred the solitude of his own neglect. The silence in the house wasn't just quiet, it was presence. Maria's presence lingered in every corner, like the faint scent of her vanilla perfume that seemed to drift through the hallway on certain evenings. Her books still lined the shelves in alphabetical order, her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand, and her worn leather prayer book still lay open to the page she'd been reading the morning before the stroke took her. That prayer book had been Maria's constant companion for as long as Leo could remember. She'd carried it to church every Sunday, opened it during difficult times, and read from it each morning before breakfast. The leather cover was soft from decades of handling, and the pages were filled with her handwritten notes in the margins. Prayers for their son David when he was struggling in school, gratitude entries when Leo received commendations at work, pleas for guidance during the rough patches that every marriage weathers. David. The name still brought a familiar ache to Leo's chest. Their only child lived 3,000 miles away in Boston, working as a software engineer for a company whose name Leo couldn't pronounce. They hadn't spoken in over 2 years, not since the funeral when harsh words had been exchanged over old wounds that should have healed decades ago. The distance between them had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with pride. Leo's pride mostly, though he'd never admit that to anyone, especially himself. The estrangement had started small, the way most family rifts do. David had wanted to study art in college. Leo had insisted on something practical. David had married a woman Leo thought wasn't good enough. Leo had made his feelings known at the worst possible moment. David had moved across the country for work. Leo had taken it as abandonment. Each decision had built another brick in the wall between them, and by the time Maria died, that wall had grown too high for either man to see over. Maria had tried to bridge the gap for years, making phone calls that Leo would silently disapprove. of sending care packages that Leo would grumble about. She'd been the translator between two stubborn men who shared the same square jaw and the same inability to say they were sorry. When she was gone, the translation service died with her. Leo's days had settled into a routine that would have depressed him if he'd allowed himself to think about it too carefully. He woke at 6, old habits from the fire station, made coffee for one, and read the newspaper from front to back, including the obituaries, where he increasingly recognized names. Breakfast was usually toast, and whatever fruit was easiest to prepare. Lunch was often skipped. Dinner came from a rotation of 5 meals he'd learned to cook competently, but without joy. The afternoons were the hardest. That's when Maria used to putter around the house, humming songs from her childhood in Mexico, while she dusted furniture that didn't need dusting or reorganized closets that were already perfectly organized. She'd had a gift for finding purpose, in small tasks, for creating meaning out of the mundane. Leo had never developed that skill. His pension from the fire department was adequate. His health was generally good, despite the wear and tear of 3 decades of physical work. And his modest house was paid for. By any practical measure, he was doing fine. But practical measures didn't account for the weight of silence, or the way an empty house could make a man feel like he was disappearing one day at a time. St. Catherine's Chapel sat at the corner of Main and Oak, a small but beautiful structure that had been built in 1952 by the growing Mexican-American community in San Rafael. The white stucco walls and red tile roof gave it a warm, welcoming appearance that had drawn Maria from the moment they'd first driven past it as young marrieds looking for a church home. Leo had been raised Catholic, but had let the practice slide during his years as a young firefighter, when Sunday mornings were often consumed by the aftermath of Saturday night calls. Maria had gently coaxed him back to regular attendance, not through nagging, but through her own obvious joy in the ritual and community. He'd gone for her initially, but had found his own kind of peace in the familiar rhythms of Mass and the simple beauty of the small sanctuary. The chapel's most striking feature was its collection of statues, donated over the years by families in the congregation. The centerpiece was a 3-foot-tall statue of the Virgin Mary, carved from white marble with delicate features and hands positioned in prayer. She stood in an alcove to the left of the altar, surrounded by votive candles and fresh flowers that the parish ladies maintained in careful rotation. Maria had claimed that spot as her own from their first visit. She would arrive early for Mass, to light a candle, and spend a few minutes in silent conversation with the statue before taking her seat. During difficult times, Leo's injury when a ceiling collapsed on him in '98, David's struggles with teenage rebellion, her own mother's slow decline into dementia, Maria would visit the chapel on weekdays just to sit in the presence of that statue and find whatever strength she needed. Leo had initially been skeptical of what he saw as superstition, but he'd grown to respect the comfort Maria found in those moments. There was something peaceful about watching his wife's face soften as she knelt before the statue, something that spoke to needs deeper than logic or reason. He'd never felt that particular connection himself, but he'd learned not to question the sources of grace in other people's lives. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now found himself thinking about the statue more often since Maria's death, not with any sense of personal connection, but with a kind of nostalgic curiosity about what Maria had seen there, what conversations she'd had, what promises she'd made or received. It was another thread connecting him to her, another remnant of their shared life that took on increased significance in her absence. Father Rodriguez had been kind in the years since the funeral, stopping by occasionally to check on Leo and always extending gentle invitations to return to regular attendance. Leo appreciated the concern, but had found it impossible to sit in their old pew without feeling Maria's absence like a physical weight. The few times he'd tried, the silence beside him had been overwhelming. The town itself had been good to Leo, in the way that small communities care for their own. Neighbors brought casseroles he didn't eat, invited him to barbecues he didn't attend, and offered help with household tasks he preferred to handle himself. Their kindness was genuine, but it also highlighted his isolation in ways that made him retreat further into solitude. Mrs. Chen from next door had taken to leaving fresh vegetables from her garden on his front porch, never directly offering them in a way that would force him to accept charity face to face. The mailman, Pete, always had a comment about the weather or the local baseball team's chances this season. The pharmacist, Dr. Walsh, asked after his health with the careful attention of someone who understood the particular vulnerabilities of men Leo's age living alone. These small kindnesses created a safety net that Leo appreciated even as he resisted depending on it. He'd been the one offering help for most of his adult life, pulling people from burning buildings, providing calm leadership during emergencies, being the steady presence that others could rely on. The role reversal felt unnatural and uncomfortable. The photograph on his mantelpiece showed the three of them during happier times: Leo, Maria, and 8-year-old David at the beach in Santa Cruz. Maria's hair was dark and full, her smile radiant as she held David's sandy hand. Leo looked younger, stronger, his arm around his wife's shoulders, with the casual confidence of a man who believed the future would unfold exactly as planned. David was gap-toothed and grinning, holding a seashell like a trophy. That photo represented everything Leo had lost and everything he'd failed to protect. The family it captured no longer existed in any form. Maria was gone. David might as well be gone, and the man in the picture bore only a physical resemblance to the person Leo had become. Sometimes he considered putting it away, but it remained the only proof that he'd once been part of something larger than himself. The earthquake, when it came, would shatter more than just buildings. It would crack open the careful shell of isolation Leo had built around himself, and force him back into a world that required action, decision, and connection. But for now, in the quiet morning light of his kitchen, he simply sat with his coffee and his memories, unaware that everything was about to change. The earthquake hit at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, while Leo was standing at his kitchen window watching Mrs. Chen water her roses. The first tremor felt like a large truck passing too close to the house, the kind of vibration that rattles windows and makes you pause but doesn't necessarily alarm you. California residents learned to distinguish between the earthquakes that matter and the ones that don't. This one mattered. The second wave hit 15 seconds later with the violence of a freight train derailing. The kitchen floor bucked beneath Leo's feet like an angry horse, sending his coffee mug crashing to the floor in a spray of ceramic and brown liquid. The windows shook so violently he was sure they'd shatter, and the familiar sound of his house groaning under stress, wood joints protesting, foundation shifting, filled the air with an ominous symphony. Leo grabbed the doorframe and rode out the motion with the instinctive balance of a man who'd experienced dozens of California earthquakes over 4 decades. But this was different. This was stronger and longer than anything he'd felt before. The kind of seismic event that changes landscapes and redraws maps. Outside, Mrs. Chen's rose trellis collapsed in a cascade of pink blooms and splintered wood. The shaking lasted 43 seconds. Leo knew because he counted them, a habit. From his firefighting days, when timing could mean the difference between life and death. 43 seconds of the earth reminding humans just how fragile their constructions really were. When the motion stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was the kind of quiet that comes after disaster, loaded with the weight of damage assessment and the terrible anticipation of what might be revealed. Leo's house had held together, a testament to the craftsmanship of its 1960s construction, but he could see cracks spiderwebbing across the living room wall where Maria's wedding portrait hung at a crooked angle. The electricity was out, but his battery-powered radio crackled to life when he found it in the kitchen drawer, where Maria had kept it for emergencies. The voice of the morning DJ, usually cheerful and energetic, was strained and professional. "This is KQED with emergency. Broadcast information. A magnitude 6.8 earthquake has struck the North Bay region at 6:47 a.m. Initial reports indicate significant structural damage throughout Marin and Sonoma counties. All residents are advised to stay away from damaged buildings and to check on neighbors, especially elderly residents who may need assistance." Leo's first instinct was to check on Mrs. Chen, but when he looked out his front window, he could see her standing in her driveway, shaken but upright, examining the damage to her garden. She waved when she saw him watching, a gesture that said she was all right even if her roses weren't. His second instinct, the one that had been trained into him through 3 decades of emergency response, was to find his old fire captain's helmet. He'd kept it in the hall closet after retirement, not as a trophy, but as a talisman, a reminder of who he'd been when his life had clear purpose and direction. The helmet was still there, undamaged, sitting on the shelf beside Maria's winter coats that he couldn't bring himself to donate to charity. The radio continued its litany of damage reports. The Bay Bridge was closed for inspection. Several buildings in downtown San Francisco had collapsed. Power was out across wide swaths of the region. And then the report that made Leo's heart skip. St. Catherine's Chapel in San Rafael has suffered significant structural damage. The building appears to have collapsed. Emergency crews are en route. St. Catherine's, Maria's chapel. The place where she'd found peace and strength, where she'd knelt before the Virgin Mary statue every Sunday for 23 years. Leo found himself moving toward his front door without conscious decision, his body responding to a call that his mind hadn't yet fully processed. The scene outside was controlled chaos. Neighbors had emerged from their houses like survivors of a bombing, gathering in small groups to compare damage and share information. The Hendersons' chimney had toppled, scattering bricks across their roof and front yard. The old oak tree that had shaded 3 houses for decades had fallen, its massive trunk blocking the street and crushing a parked car with casual indifference. But it was the column of dust rising from the direction of downtown that drew Leo's attention and quickened his pace. He'd seen that kind of dust before. The powder that comes from masonry and concrete reduced to rubble. It meant total structural failure. It meant that whatever had stood there an hour ago was now a pile of debris. Leo grabbed his helmet and started walking toward downtown San Rafael, his firefighters' training automatically cataloging potential hazards: downed power lines, broken gas mains, unstable structures that might collapse in aftershocks. Other residents were moving in the same direction, drawn by the same mixture of curiosity and concern that compels people to witness disaster firsthand. The damage grew more severe as he approached the town center. Windows were blown out of storefronts. Their contents spilled onto sidewalks like the intestines of gutted buildings. Cars were buried under fallen awnings and signage. The old brick facade of Martinez Bakery, where Leo and Maria had bought their wedding cake 44 years ago, had simply vanished, leaving the wooden frame exposed like architectural skeleton. And then he turned the corner onto Main Street and saw St. Catherine's Chapel, or what had been St. Catherine's Chapel. The building had pancaked in on itself with the brutal efficiency that only earthquakes can achieve. The red tile roof had come down first, followed by the walls, followed by everything that had made it a place of worship rather than just another pile of construction materials. The white stucco walls that had welcomed parishioners for 71 years were now fragments scattered across the small parking lot like broken teeth. Leo stood there for a moment, his helmet in his hands, processing a level of destruction that went beyond the physical. This wasn't just the collapse of a building, it was the obliteration of a community's spiritual center, the place where generations of families had marked life's most important moments. Baptisms, confirmations, weddings, funerals, all of it buried under tons of debris. but it was the thought of the Virgin Mary statue that galvanized him into action. That beautiful marble figure that had been Maria's anchor, her source of comfort and strength, it was somewhere under all that rubble, probably shattered beyond recognition. The idea of leaving it there, of letting it be bulldozed away with the rest of the debris, felt like a betrayal of every prayer Maria had whispered in its presence. Other people had gathered around the edges of the destruction, keeping a respectful distance from the unstable pile of concrete and timber. Someone was saying that the fire department was on their way, that nobody should go near the wreckage until it could be properly assessed for safety. Someone else mentioned that the parish priest, Father Rodriguez, was out of town visiting his sister in Los Angeles and wouldn't return until Friday. Leo wasn't listening to any of them. He was studying the debris pile with the trained eye of someone who'd spent his career extracting people from dangerous situations. The roof had come down relatively intact before breaking apart, which meant there might be void spaces underneath. The altar area would have been toward the back of the building, which appeared to have suffered less catastrophic damage. If the statue had survived the initial collapse, it would be in the left rear corner where Maria's alcove had been. He put on his helmet and started picking his way carefully across the rubble. "Hey, you can't go in there," someone called from the street. "It's not safe." Leo turned back briefly. "I'm a retired fire captain," he said simply. "I know what I'm doing." It wasn't entirely true. Structural collapse was a specialty that required current training and proper equipment, but it was true enough. He understood how buildings fell and where people might survive. More importantly, he understood that some things were worth the risk of recovery. The rubble was treacherous, shifting under his weight with each step. Broken glass and splintered wood created a minefield of potential injury. Twisted rebar jutted from concrete chunks like metallic bones. But Leo moved steadily forward, testing each foothold, listening for the groans and creaks that might signal an impending secondary collapse. He found the statue buried under a section of fallen beam and chunks of decorative plaster, in almost exactly the spot where he'd expected it to be. The marble had survived the impact better than he'd dared hope. A chip on the left hand, a crack across the base, but the serene face was intact and the praying hands remained positioned in their eternal gesture of supplication. Getting it out required 20 minutes of careful excavation, moving debris piece by piece while monitoring the stability of the pile around him. His hands were cut and bleeding by the time he could lift the statue free, but Maria's Virgin Mary was safe. Though, moment, his fingers closed around the carved marble, the earth shuddered once more. Not a major aftershock, but significant enough to shift the debris pile and send everyone on the street scrambling for open ground. Leo braced himself and waited for the motion to pass, but it didn't pass. It simply stopped. Stopped abruptly, as if someone had thrown a switch to turn off the earthquake. 1 second the ground was moving, the next it was perfectly still in a way that felt almost supernatural. Leo had experienced hundreds of aftershocks in his lifetime, and they all followed the same pattern, building to a peak and then gradually fading away. This was different. This was like the earth itself had decided that enough was enough. He looked down at the statue in his arms, at the peaceful marble face that had comforted his wife through so many difficulties. For just a moment, standing there in the ruins of the chapel with the Virgin Mary cradled against his chest, Leo felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense that he wasn't entirely alone in the world. The feeling passed quickly, dismissed as adrenaline and the strange emotional aftermath of narrowly avoiding injury. But as he picked his way back across the rubble pile toward the street, Leo couldn't shake the impression that the timing had been more than coincidental. The crowd that had gathered to watch his rescue attempt greeted him with applause and expressions of concern for his safety. Someone had called the local newspaper, and a photographer snapped pictures of Leo emerging from the ruins with the statue. In his arms, images that would run on the front page the next morning under the headline, "Local Hero Saves Sacred Statue." Leo wasn't interested in being a hero. He was interested in getting the statue home safely, in finding it a place of honor where it could continue its silent ministry. Maria would have known exactly where it should go and how it should be cared for. Without her guidance, he'd have to figure it out for himself. As he walked back through the damaged streets of San Rafael, the Virgin Mary statue secure in his arms, Leo didn't notice the small crowd that followed at a respectful distance. He didn't hear the murmured conversations about divine intervention and miraculous timing. He was focused on the future rather than the past for the first time in 3 years, thinking about responsibility rather than loss. The earthquake had taken St. Catherine's Chapel, but it had given Leo something back, a sense of purpose, a mission that connected him to his wife's memory and to the community he'd been withdrawing from. He didn't know yet what that would mean or where it would lead him. He would find out soon enough. The Virgin Mary statue found its place on the small table beside Maria's chair in the living room, where it seemed to belong as naturally as if it had always been there. Leo had cleaned the marble carefully with a soft cloth and warm water, removing the dust and debris from its rescue while being mindful of the chip on the left hand and the crack across the base. The damage somehow made it more precious rather than less, like scars that tell a story worth remembering. He'd positioned it so it faced the kitchen, where Maria used to sit for her morning prayers, the same morning light that had once illuminated her face as she read from her worn prayer book, now fell across the statue's serene features, creating shadows that seemed to shift throughout the day like expressions of gentle acknowledgement. The first dream came 3 nights after the earthquake. Leo had never been much of a dreamer, at least not the kind who remembered his dreams or gave them much significance. But this one was different, vivid and specific in a way that felt more like memory than imagination. He was standing in their old kitchen, the one from their first apartment in Oakland, where they'd lived as newlyweds. Maria was at the stove, making eggs the way she used to, with extra pepper and a sprinkle of cheese, humming a Mexican lullaby her grandmother had taught her. She looked young in the dream, maybe 25, with her hair in a long braid down her back, and her favorite blue dress that she'd worn until it was too faded to be presentable. When she turned to smile at him, her face held the same expression of quiet joy he remembered from their early years together before the weight of disappointment and loss had taught them both to guard their happiness more carefully. "The statue is beautiful where you put it," she said in the dream, though her lips didn't move and her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "She's been waiting to come home." Leo woke with tears on his cheeks and the smell of eggs and coffee so real, he got up to check if someone was in his kitchen. The house was empty, of course, but the sense of Maria's presence lingered like perfume. In an enclosed room, he made coffee and sat at the table, looking at the statue and trying to convince himself that dreams were just the brain's way of processing stress and change. But the dreams continued, becoming more frequent and more detailed. Sometimes Maria appeared as she had at different stages of their marriage, young and hopeful, middle-aged and tired, older and wise. She rarely spoke directly, but her presence conveyed messages that Leo understood on a level deeper than words. Forgiveness, peace, the importance of connection. Always, in these dreams, the Virgin Mary statue was somewhere in the background, a constant presence watching over both of them. During his waking hours, Leo began to notice changes in his physical condition that he initially attributed to the stress of the earthquake and the exertion of the rescue. His appetite decreased, gradually making even his favorite foods taste like cardboard. Coffee, which had been one of his few remaining pleasures, began to upset his stomach. He felt tired in a way that sleep didn't cure, a bone-deep weariness that made simple tasks feel like major undertakings. Mrs. Chen noticed the difference when she brought him a container of homemade soup 2 weeks after the earthquake. "You," "Look thin, Leo," she said, with the direct concern of someone who'd known him for 15 years. "Are you eating enough?" He assured her that he was fine, just adjusting to all the changes in the town since the disaster. The cleanup effort was ongoing, with heavy machinery working around the clock to clear debris and assess structural damage. The sound of reconstruction had become the new soundtrack of San Rafael. Hammering, drilling, the backup beepers of construction, vehicles. It was enough to disturb anyone's sleep and appetite, but Leo knew the changes in his body were more than stress-related. There was a subtle wrongness in the way he felt, a sense that his physical systems weren't working with their usual efficiency. Food sat heavily in his stomach. Climbing the stairs to his bedroom left him more winded than it should. Simple tasks like mowing the lawn or carrying groceries required more effort than they had even a month ago. Still, he avoided calling his doctor. Dr. Patterson had been Maria's physician as well as his own, and visits to the medical clinic carried too many memories of waiting rooms and anxious conversations about test results and treatment options. Leo had spent enough time in medical facilities during Maria's final months to last him the rest of his life. The ring on his left hand had grown looser, another sign of weight loss that he couldn't ignore forever. Maria's wedding ring. He still thought of it that way, even though he'd worn it for 44 years, was a simple gold band that had once fit snugly enough to require soap for removal. Now it turned freely on his finger, sliding around when he moved his hand. He'd considered having it resized, but that felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. His neighbors had begun to treat him differently since the earthquake rescue. The local newspaper article had made him something of a celebrity, at least by San Rafael standards. People nodded with extra warmth when they passed him on the street. The clerk at the grocery store always asked about his health and thanked him for saving the statue. Father Rodriguez had stopped by twice to express the parish's gratitude and to update him on plans for rebuilding the chapel. The attention was well-meaning but uncomfortable. Leo had never sought recognition for doing what seemed like the obvious thing to do. Maria would have rescued that statue if she'd been physically able. Any decent person would have done the same. The idea that his actions were heroic rather than simply human made him feel like a fraud. More troubling was the way some people looked at him now, with a kind of reverence that suggested they saw something in the rescue that Leo himself didn't understand. Mrs. Henderson from down the street had started crossing herself when she saw him, and several Hispanic families from the parish had approached him with requests to touch the statue or pray in its presence. The local Spanish-language newspaper had run a story suggesting that divine intervention had guided Leo to the statue and protected him during the rescue. Leo discouraged such interpretations whenever possible. The timing of the aftershock had been coincidental, nothing more. The fact that he'd emerged from the rubble uninjured was luck combined with experience, not supernatural protection. The Virgin Mary was a beautiful piece of religious art with sentimental value, not a source of miracles. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the statue seemed to glow faintly in the reflected light from the street lamp outside, Leo sometimes wondered if his rational explanations were incomplete. There had been something about that moment. When the earthquake stopped, something about the weight of the statue in his arms that felt significant in a way he couldn't articulate or dismiss. The phone calls he didn't make weighed on him more heavily than the ones he did. David's number was still programmed into his cell phone, though Leo couldn't remember the last time he'd scrolled to it. Several times over the past few weeks, he'd found himself holding the phone and considering what he might say if his son answered. But the conversations he imagined all began with explanations that sounded like excuses, and ended with the same stubborn silences that had driven them apart. In the first place, Maria's prayer book lay open on the table beside the statue, turned to a page she'd marked with a faded ribbon years ago. The highlighted passage was from the Gospel of Matthew. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." In the margin, she'd written in her careful handwriting, "For Leo's troubled sleep, 1998. That had been the year of his injury, when nightmares about the ceiling collapse had robbed him of rest for months. Now, looking at her note and remembering her quiet concern for his well-being, Leo felt the full weight of his isolation. Maria had been his translator, not just with David, but with the world itself. She'd helped him understand his own emotions and navigate relationships that his natural stoicism made difficult. Without her, he was like a man trying to read a book in a language he'd never fully learned. The statue offered no easy answers, but its presence provided a kind of comfort that Leo was reluctant to examine too closely. It was a tangible connection to Maria's faith and to the community they'd been part of together. Whether it possessed any inherent power beyond that human significance was a question he wasn't ready to explore. For now, it was enough that the dreams of Maria had become less painful and more peaceful, that the house felt slightly less empty, and that he had something concrete to care for besides his own declining needs. The statue required daily dusting, weekly careful cleaning, and the kind of gentle attention that Maria had once given to everything she valued. It was a responsibility that felt manageable, even as other responsibilities. His health, his relationship with his son, his place in the community seemed to be slipping beyond his control. Leo didn't know yet how much his control was about to be tested, or how little time he had left to make the choices that would define the rest of his life. But the Virgin Mary statue waited patiently, as it had waited patiently in the chapel for 71 years, ready to offer whatever comfort and guidance he was finally prepared to accept. Dr. Patricia Patterson had been practicing family medicine in San Rafael for 38 years, long enough to recognize when a patient was holding back important information. Leo sat across from her in the familiar examination room, where he'd received countless updates about Maria's condition during her final months. His hands folded carefully in his lap, and his answers to her questions just a beat too casual. "How long have you been experiencing the fatigue?" she asked, making notes in his chart while keeping her tone professionally neutral. Dr. Patterson had learned that direct confrontation rarely worked with men Leo's age, especially former first responders who'd been trained to minimize their own discomfort. "Few weeks, maybe a month," Leo said, though they both knew it had been longer. The weight loss was visible in his face, and his shirt hung loose around his shoulders in a way that suggested significant changes over a period of months rather than weeks. "And the appetite loss? Food doesn't taste right anymore. Could be stress from the earthquake, all the changes in town." He was offering her an easy explanation, an out that would let both of them avoid more difficult possibilities. Dr. Patterson had seen Leo through a heart attack scare in 2019, a bout with pneumonia the winter after Maria died, and the slow recovery from his injury in 98. She knew him as a stoic man who'd rather endure discomfort than admit weakness, but she also knew him as someone who'd always been forthright about medical concerns when pressed directly. The physical examination revealed what she'd suspected from the moment Leo had walked into her office. The yellowing of his sclera was subtle but unmistakable. His abdomen was tender in a way that suggested deeper problems than indigestion. The lymph nodes in his neck were enlarged, though he hadn't mentioned any symptoms that would normally bring that to his attention. "Leo," she said when the examination was complete, "I'm going to order some blood work and imaging studies. There are several possibilities for what might be causing your symptoms, but I want to rule out some more serious conditions." He nodded with the resigned acceptance of a man who'd been expecting bad news for weeks. "How serious?" "That's what the tests will tell us. Can you come back Friday for the blood draw? And I'd like to schedule you for a CT scan early next week." The manila folder containing his test results seemed to grow heavier in Dr. Patterson's, and over the 3 days it took to compile all the information she needed. The blood chemistry told a clear story. elevated liver enzymes, abnormal protein levels, markers that pointed toward a diagnosis she'd hoped to rule out rather than confirm. The CT images were even more definitive, showing masses that had no business being in a healthy 77-year-old's abdomen. She'd called Leo on Thursday to ask him to come in Friday morning instead of just stopping by for routine follow-up. The change in scheduling, along with her carefully neutral tone, had probably told him everything he needed to know about what the conversation would contain. Leo arrived 10 minutes early and spent the time in the waiting room staring at a magazine he wasn't reading. When Dr. Patterson called him back to her office instead of an examination room, he understood the significance of that choice as well. Good news could be delivered anywhere. Difficult news required privacy and comfortable chairs. The tests confirm what I suspected, she said after they were both seated. You have pancreatic cancer, Leo. Advanced pancreatic cancer. The words hung in the air between them like a verdict that couldn't be appealed. Leo had been preparing himself for this moment since the symptoms began, but hearing the diagnosis spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. Pancreatic cancer. The same disease that had taken his brother-in-law 5 years ago, a rapid and merciless decline that had lasted less than 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. How long? Leo asked, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. Stage 4 means it's spread to other organs. Without treatment, we're looking at weeks rather than months, 2 to 4 weeks most likely. Dr. Patterson had delivered hundreds of similar diagnoses over her career, but it never became easier, especially with patients she'd known for decades. And with treatment, chemotherapy might extend that to 2 to 4 months, possibly 6, if you respond well. But Leo, I have to be honest with you, the treatment would be aggressive with significant side effects. Many patients your age choose comfort care instead. Comfort care, the medical euphemism for giving up, for choosing dignity over a few extra weeks of suffering. Leo understood the appeal, had seen what aggressive cancer treatment could do to people, had watched strong men reduced to shadows of themselves in pursuit of a few additional days. I need some time to think about it, he said. Dr. Patterson handed him several brochures and a folder containing his test results. Take all the time you need. And Leo, this doesn't have to be a decision you make alone. Do you want me to help you contact David? The suggestion was kindly meant, but it highlighted the isolation that would make this journey even more difficult. Other patients had spouses to consult, children to consider, support systems that helped them navigate the practical and emotional complexities of terminal illness. Leo had a son 3,000 miles away who might not even take his call. I'll handle that myself, he said, though they both doubted he would. The drive home from Dr. Patterson's office passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Leo noticed details that usually escaped his attention, the way afternoon light fell across the courthouse steps, the precise shade of red in Mrs. Morrison's, roses, the sound of children playing in the elementary school yard. It was as if his brain, newly aware of its limited time for processing the world, had shifted into a higher resolution mode. His house looked different when he pulled into the driveway, smaller somehow and less permanent. The modest 2-story with white shutters that had represented stability and accomplishment for 4 decades now seemed like a temporary arrangement, a way station rather than a final destination. Inside, the Virgin Mary statue waited on its table, beside Maria's chair, unchanged by the news that had just reconfigured Leo's entire future. The afternoon light, falling across its carved features, created the same patterns of shadow and illumination that Leo had been observing for weeks, a consistency that felt comforting in a world that had just become fundamentally uncertain. He sat in his usual chair across from the statue and opened the folder Dr. Patterson had given him. The test results were presented in medical terminology that he didn't fully understand, but the images were clear enough. Dark masses where there should have been healthy tissue, numbers that were well outside normal ranges, a progression of disease that had been advancing silently while he'd attributed his symptoms to stress and grief. The brochures offered information about treatment options, support groups, and hospice care. One pamphlet featured a serene elderly couple walking hand in hand through a garden, as if terminal cancer could be faced with the same peaceful acceptance as retirement planning. The disconnect between the marketing imagery and the reality of what lay ahead would have been amusing if it weren't so personally relevant. Leo found himself thinking about Maria's final months, the way cancer had systematically stripped away everything that made her herself, while leaving behind a physical shell that bore increasingly little resemblance to the woman he'd married. She'd fought bravely, endured treatments that were almost as destructive as the disease, and maintained hope long past the point where hope served any practical purpose. In the end, the cancer had won anyway, as it almost always did. The additional months of life that treatment had provided had been months of diminished quality, marked more by medical appointments and side effects than by the simple pleasures that had once defined their days together. Did he want to repeat that experience as the patient rather than the caregiver? Did he want to spend his remaining weeks in hospitals and clinics fighting a battle that the statistics suggested he couldn't win? Or would there be more dignity in accepting the timeline that nature had imposed and making peace with his circumstances, while he still had the strength to do so on his own terms? The phone sat on the side table within easy reach, David's number stored in its memory, along with all the conversations Leo had imagined having but never initiated. This would be the call that mattered, the one that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. His son deserved to know about the diagnosis, deserved the chance to decide whether their estrangement would outlast Leo's life. But what would he say? How did you tell your only child that you were dying when you hadn't spoken in over 2 years, when the last words exchanged had been angry ones that neither of you had found a way to take back? Leo picked up the phone 3 times over the next hour, scrolled to David's number, and put it down again without dialing. Each time, the conversation he imagined began with explanations that sounded like excuses and ended with the same uncomfortable silences that had characterized their relationship for decades. The Virgin Mary statue offered no guidance beyond its eternal expression of serene acceptance. If Maria were here, she would know what to say to both of them, how to translate love through the barriers that pride and stubbornness had erected. She'd always been the bridge between Leo's emotional reticence and David's need for connection, the interpreter who helped them understand that their inability to communicate didn't diminish their fundamental care for each other. Without her translation services, they were like speakers of different languages, trying to express complex feelings through gestures and facial expressions that could be easily misunderstood. Evening settled over San Rafael with the particular, a quiet that comes after life-changing news. Leo made dinner that he didn't eat, watched television programs that he didn't follow, and went through the motions of his evening routine while his mind processed the reality of limited time. 2 to 4 weeks, 14 to 28 days, to settle accounts, make peace with regrets, and find some kind of meaning in a life that would soon end, whether he was ready or not. It wasn't enough time to repair 40 years of accumulated mistakes, but it might be enough time to make a few crucial phone calls and arrange for his affairs to be handled responsibly. That night, Leo dreamed of Maria again, but this time the dream was different. She appeared as she had been in her final weeks, thin and fragile, but with eyes that held deep wells of hard-won wisdom. They were in a place he didn't recognize, a garden filled with flowers that seemed to glow from within. "You're afraid to call him," she said, her voice clear despite the ethereal quality of the dream setting. "I don't know what to say. It's been too long. Say what you should have said years ago. Say what you won't have the chance to say later." When Leo woke, his cheeks were wet with tears, but his mind was clearer than it had been since receiving the diagnosis. The Virgin Mary statue seemed to be watching him with particular attention, its marble eyes reflecting the pre-dawn light in a way that suggested patient encouragement. 2 to 4 weeks. it would have to be enough. St. Francis Hospice sat on a gentle hill overlooking San Rafael, its adobe walls and landscaped gardens designed to provide dignity during life's most vulnerable transition. Leo had driven past it countless times without thought, but now it represented his final destination. Father Miguel Hernandez met Leo at the entrance, a compact man whose gentle demeanor masked the strength required to shepherd people through their final weeks. "Mr. Martinez," he said with genuine warmth, "I was at St. Catherine's after the earthquake. What you did, rescuing that statue, that was beautiful." "My wife used to pray to it every Sunday," Leo replied. "Seemed wrong to leave it buried." "Faith calls us to act beyond our normal limitations," Father Miguel said as they walked through quiet corridors. Leo's second-floor room faced west toward the hills, furnished more like a hotel than a hospital. The hospice key felt heavier than its actual weight. This would be his final address. He'd brought only essentials: clothes, shaving kit, a photograph of Maria, and the Virgin Mary statue. Father Miguel's eyes widened when he saw the carved marble figure. "This is very special. Hand-carved in Mexico in 1950, blessed by Archbishop Martinez himself. Many families have prayed before this statue over the decades. Every Sunday for 23 years, Leo confirmed. It was her anchor. They placed the statue near the window, where afternoon light would illuminate its features. In this setting, the Virgin Mary seemed both out of place and perfectly at home, a bridge between the sacred and mundane. His roommate was Frank Delacroix, a retired construction foreman further along in his cancer journey. Though conversation required effort, Frank's eyes remained sharp. "That's a beautiful statue," Frank whispered that first evening. "It belonged to my wife. She passed 3 years ago." Frank smiled with understanding. "My Ellen's been gone 4 years. Still talk to her every night. She never answers back, but I know she's listening." The admission opened doors between them. Here, facing the same destination, pretense became irrelevant. Frank had been married 47 years, raised 3 children, and spent months coming to terms with mortality. "The hardest part isn't the dying," Frank said during late-night talks. "It's the regrets. Things I should have said, done differently. You reach the end and realize how much time you wasted on foolish pride." Leo understood completely. "I have a son in Boston. We haven't spoken in over 2 years. Don't even know if he's aware I'm sick." Frank looked directly at him. "Then you know what you have to do. The question is whether you'll do it while there's still time." Days at St. Francis developed their own rhythm. Leo's condition remained stable. He had weeks rather than days. Other residents came and went, approaching their final weeks with varying combinations of acceptance, anger, fear, and grace. The Virgin Mary statue became a focal point beyond Leo's attention. Nurses paused to admire it. Visitors asked about its history. Other residents requested permission to sit quietly in its presence, finding comfort in its serene expression. Father Miguel visited regularly, offering human connection that transcended denominational boundaries. "Your wife's statue has become a blessing to the entire facility," he mentioned. "People find peace in its presence." "Maria always said it had a way of listening without judgment," Leo replied. "Maybe that's what people need when everything's falling apart." Leo's dreams of Maria became more frequent and vivid. She appeared as she'd been during their best years, confident, with inner strength that had carried their family through challenges. Her presence conveyed messages deeper than words: forgiveness, reconciliation, the importance of reaching out before it was too late. The hospice key had become familiar in Leo's hands, another symbol of transition. 2 weeks remained according to Dr. Patterson's prognosis. 14 days to bridge years of gaps, find peace with unchangeable choices, and determine whether his final chapter would be marked by isolation or connection. The Virgin Mary statue waited patiently, offering the same comfort it had provided Maria and countless others. Soon, Leo would discover whether that comfort extended to miracles as well as peace. The baseball glove appeared among Leo's belongings on Tuesday morning, buried beneath extra blankets. He hadn't seen it in 20 years. Cracked leather, frayed. Laces, but the Wilson logo still visible on the palm where 10-year-old David's hands had gripped it summer after summer. Leo remembered Saturday afternoons in Crane Park when David had been determined to make Little League despite being smaller than his teammates. They'd practiced for hours, Leo pitching underhand while David worked on catching. The glove represented those simpler times when their relationship had been built around shared activities rather than competing expectations. His condition had worsened significantly over recent days. Pain that had been manageable now required prescription relief that left him drowsy for hours. Simple tasks like showering required assistance, a loss of independence that felt almost as devastating as the disease itself. Frank had taken a turn for the worse too, conversations reduced to whispered fragments. But when he saw Leo examining the baseball glove, he managed a knowing smile. "Your boy," Frank whispered. "My boy," Leo confirmed. Long time ago. The dreams had intensified with his physical decline, becoming so vivid that Leo sometimes had difficulty distinguishing sleep from waking. Maria appeared nightly in settings from their shared past, their first apartment, the house during David's childhood, vacation spots where they'd been happy. In the most recent dream, she'd sat in their old kitchen, while 10-year-old David practiced multiplication tables. The scene was so detailed, Leo could smell her coffee and hear David's pencil scratching paper. "He's trying so hard to get everything right," Maria had said, watching their son struggle. "He wants to make you proud." "I am proud of him," Leo had replied. "Have you told him that? Have you told him lately?" Leo had woken with tears on his cheeks and clear understanding that time was running out for conversations that should have happened years ago. The phone sat on his bedside table, David's number still programmed, but the effort required seemed overwhelming when combined with his medication-induced fatigue. Father Miguel found him holding the baseball glove during one of his visits, staring at it like someone trying to solve a complex problem. "That looks like it has stories to tell," the chaplain said, settling beside Leo's bed. "My son's glove from Little League. Found it mixed in with my things. Don't remember packing it." Leo's voice was weaker than even a week ago. "Sometimes what we need most finds us when we're ready. Have you been in touch with your son since you've been here?" Leo shook his head. "We had words at his mother's funeral. Haven't spoken since. Don't know if he knows I'm sick." "What kind of words?" "The kind that cut deep and stick around. He blamed me for not getting Maria better medical care sooner, said I was too stubborn to admit she needed help I couldn't provide. He wasn't wrong, but hearing it at her graveside," Leo's voice trailed off. Father Miguel recognized the anguish of relationships damaged by grief and misunderstanding. "Grief makes us say things we don't mean, and mean things we're afraid to say. Your son was hurting, and hurt people often lash out at the ones they love most." "Maybe. But he was right about Maria. I should have insisted on more aggressive treatment. Earlier, gotten second opinions, pushed harder with doctors. I let my fear of hospitals keep her from getting the care she deserved." It was the first time Leo had voiced that guilt aloud, the self-accusation eating at him for 3 years. Maria had been experiencing symptoms for months before he'd convinced her to see Dr. Patterson, and by then cancer had already spread. "You did the best you could with the information you had," Father Miguel said gently, "but carrying that guilt isn't serving anyone now. Not you, not Maria's memory, and not your relationship with your son." Leo looked at the Virgin Mary statue. "She used to say forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself, not something you did for other people. Never understood what she meant until now. And now? Now I realize I've been punishing myself and David for things that can't be changed. But I don't know how to stop, how to bridge 3 years of silence." Father Miguel glanced at the baseball glove, the phone, the statue that seemed to listen with marble patience. "Maybe you start with something simple. Tell him about the glove, the memories it brings back. Sometimes the smallest gestures open the biggest doors." That evening, Leo held the phone and stared at David's number. His fingers felt clumsy from medication, his mind kept losing focus, but urgency was becoming undeniable. Dr. Patterson had stopped by that afternoon, and while she hadn't said anything directly, her expression conveyed that weeks were becoming. Days faster than anticipated. He dialed 3 times and hung up before it could ring. Each time, he imagined David seeing his name on caller ID and deciding whether to answer. Each time, he imagined the awkward silence that would follow, "Hello," the weight of 3 years pressing down on a conversation that needed to happen naturally. Frank stirred in the next bed, breathing labored but steady. "Just call him," he whispered, without opening his eyes. "Whatever you're going to say it now. Tomorrow might be too late." The words carried authority from someone who understood procrastination's consequences. Frank's own children had made peace with him weeks ago, flying in from across the country for final conversations and forgiveness. He'd been blessed with family reconciliation that Leo was still hoping to achieve. Leo held the baseball glove against his chest and closed his eyes, trying to summon courage that had once allowed him to run into burning buildings. Physical danger had always been easier than emotional vulnerability. Fighting fires required training and equipment, but fighting for relationships required the kind of honesty that left a person completely exposed. In his dream that night, Maria appeared as she'd been during David's Little League years, younger, energetic, wearing team colors and cheering from bleachers. She held the same baseball glove, turning it over in her hands. "He kept this in his room until college," she said. "Even after he stopped playing, even after he decided baseball wasn't important anymore. It reminded him of when you were proud of him for trying his best instead of disappointed in him for not being perfect." "I was always proud of him," Leo protested. "But did you tell him that? When it mattered? When he was young enough to believe?" "It completely." Leo woke knowing he had perhaps one day of sufficient clarity to make the phone call that could change everything or confirm that some distances were too great to bridge. The baseball glove sat beside the phone, a reminder of better times and a challenge to create one final moment of connection. The Virgin Mary statue watched both objects with eternal patient hope, as if waiting to see whether faith in second chances could triumph over pride and fear. Soon, Leo would discover whether courage, once used to save others, could be summoned to save the relationship that mattered most. The pain that woke Leo at 3:17 in the morning was unlike anything he'd experienced in 77 years. It started as burning in his abdomen and spread outward like liquid fire, making even breathing feel impossible. The morphine pump provided no relief, and his desperate attempts to press the call button were hampered by hands that wouldn't respond. Frank was already gone. The bed beside Leo's was empty, stripped and waiting. Frank had passed quietly 2 nights earlier, surrounded by his children in peaceful closure that Leo had observed with equal measures of envy and gratitude. Now, Leo was alone, except for the Virgin Mary statue, which sat bathed in pale light from parking lot security lamps. The carved marble seemed to glow with inner radiance, though Leo attributed that to morphine and his deteriorating mental state. The burning intensified until Leo was certain his body was consuming itself from the inside out. This was the end. Stage Dr. Patterson had warned about, when comfort care became the only option, because disease had overwhelmed his system's ability to function. He'd hoped for more days, enough time to make the phone call that would repair or permanently sever his relationship with David, but time had run out. Leo tried reaching for the call button, managing only to knock it to the floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud, but no one came. The night staff respected residents' privacy during final passages, unless specifically requested otherwise. As pain reached a crescendo, making consciousness almost impossible, Leo found himself looking directly at the Virgin Mary statue. The soft glow was becoming brighter, more defined, as if the marble itself was generating light rather than reflecting it. The statue's face seemed to turn slightly toward him, though he knew that was impossible. But the light was undeniable now, warm, golden radiance that filled the room with illumination, suggesting sunrise rather than artificial sources. Leo blinked hard, trying to separate reality from medication-induced fantasy, but the glow only became more pronounced. And then, in a moment that would remain seared in his memory, the pain simply vanished. Not gradually, as might happen when medication took effect, but instantly and completely, as if someone had thrown a switch. The burning disappeared, the crushing weight lifted, and weakness was replaced by vitality he hadn't felt in months. Leo sat up without assistance for the first time in weeks, movements fluid and natural instead of careful, painful adjustments. His mind cleared of medication fog, leaving him alert and focused in a way that seemed impossible given his condition minutes earlier. The Virgin Mary statue was definitely glowing now. Light emanated from within the marble, creating a soft aureole that pulsed gently like a slow heartbeat. The statue's eyes seemed to hold depth and awareness beyond artistic skill. Leo reached tentatively toward the light, half expecting his hand to pass through illusion. Instead, his fingers encountered warmth like concentrated sunlight. The sensation traveled through his entire body, carrying profound peace completely foreign to his recent experience. "Maria?" he whispered, unsure why her name came to his lips. The statue remained motionless except for steady light pulse. But Leo felt a presence beyond his own consciousness. Not Maria herself, but something touched by her faith, blessed by her prayers, infused with the love and hope she'd brought to conversations with the carved figure. The glow began fading after what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. As it diminished, Leo became aware that his body felt fundamentally different, not just free from pain, but restored in ways defying medical explanation. His breathing was easy and deep, heartbeat steady and strong, mind clear of recent confusion. When the last traces of supernatural illumination disappeared, leaving only ordinary parking lot lights, Leo was left with stunning realization that something impossible had occurred. The cancer, systematically destroying his body, was simply gone. He could feel its absence like a weight lifted, poison extracted, darkness replaced by light. He sat in the quiet room for the rest of the night, watching the statue and trying to process what he'd experienced. Every rational part insisted he'd hallucinated the entire episode, that morphine and deteriorating condition had created vivid dreams more real than reality. But his body told a different story, healing that couldn't be explained by medicine or science. When morning shift arrived at 7:30, they found Leo sitting in his chair, fully dressed, alert, and apparently pain-free for the first time since admission. The change was so dramatic that Nurse Jennifer initially thought she'd entered the wrong room. "Mr. Martinez, how are you feeling this morning?" "I feel—" Leo paused, searching for adequate words. "I feel like myself again. The pain is gone. Everything is different." Jennifer approached with cautious professionalism of someone who'd seen enough terminal patients to know apparent improvements will often follow. The pain that woke Leo at 3:17 in the morning was unlike anything he'd experienced in his 77 years. It started as a burning sensation deep in his abdomen and spread outward like liquid fire, consuming every nerve ending and making even the simple act of breathing feel like an impossible task. The morphine pump beside his bed provided no relief, and his desperate attempts to press the call button were hampered by hands that wouldn't respond to his brain's urgent commands. Frank was already gone. The bed beside Leo's was empty, its linens stripped and waiting for the next resident who would need its temporary comfort. Frank had passed quietly 2 nights earlier, surrounded by his children and grandchildren in a scene of peaceful closure that Leo had observed with equal measures of envy and gratitude. At least one of them had achieved the kind of ending that everyone hoped for but few actually received. Now Leo was alone in the room, except for the Virgin Mary statue, which sat on its table bathed in the pale light from the parking lot security lamps outside his window. The carved marble seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, though Leo attributed that to the morphine and his deteriorating mental state. Pain had a way of creating hallucinations that felt more real than reality itself. The burning in his abdomen intensified until Leo was certain his body was literally consuming itself from the inside out. This was the end stage that Dr. Patterson had warned him about, the point where comfort care became the only option because the disease had overwhelmed his system's ability to function. He'd hoped for a few more days, maybe a week, enough time to make the phone call that would either repair or permanently sever his relationship with David. But time, it seemed, had run out. Leo tried to reach for the call button one more time, managing to knock it off the bedside table instead of grasping it. The sound of plastic hitting the floor seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet hospice, but no one came running. The night staff was accustomed to the sounds of people struggling with their final passages, and unless someone specifically requested help, they respected the privacy of residents who needed to face their mortality on their own terms. As the pain reached a crescendo that made consciousness almost impossible to maintain, Leo found himself looking directly at the Virgin Mary statue. The soft glow he'd attributed to hallucination was becoming brighter, more defined, as if the marble itself was generating light rather than simply reflecting it. The statue's face seemed to turn slightly toward him, though he knew that was impossible. Carved. Stone didn't move, didn't respond to human suffering, didn't offer comfort beyond the symbolic. But the light was undeniable now, a warm golden radiance that filled the room with the kind of illumination that suggested sunrise rather than artificial sources. Leo blinked hard, trying to clear his vision and separate reality from medication-induced fantasy, but the glow only became more pronounced. And then, in a moment that would remain seared in his memory for the rest of his life, the pain simply vanished. Not gradually, as might happen when medication finally took effect, but instantly and completely, as if someone had thrown a switch to turn off every source of discomfort in his body. The burning sensation disappeared, the crushing weight in his chest lifted, and the weakness that had been steadily draining his strength was replaced by a vitality he hadn't felt in months. Leo sat up in bed without assistance for the first time. In weeks, his movements fluid and natural, instead of the careful, painful adjustments that had marked his recent days. His mind cleared of the fog that medication had created, leaving him alert and focused in a way that seemed impossible given his condition just minutes earlier. The Virgin Mary statue was definitely glowing now. There was no question about that. The light emanated from within the marble itself, creating a soft aureole around the carved figure that pulsed gently like a slow heartbeat. The statue's eyes, which had always been beautiful but static, seemed to hold depth and awareness that went beyond artistic skill. Leo reached out tentatively toward the light, half expecting his hand to pass through an optical illusion. Instead, his fingers encountered warmth that felt like sunlight concentrated into a physical presence. The sensation traveled up his arm and through his entire body, carrying with it a sense of peace that was both profound and completely foreign to his recent experience. "Maria?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure why her name came to his lips. The statue remained motionless except for the steady pulse of its inner light. But Leo felt a presence in the room that went beyond his own consciousness. Not Maria herself, but something that had been touched by her faith, blessed by her daily prayers, infused with the love and hope she'd brought to her conversations with the carved figure. The glow began to fade after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. As it diminished, Leo became aware that his body felt fundamentally different, not just free from pain, but restored in ways that defied medical explanation. His breathing was easy and deep, his heartbeat steady and strong, his mind clear of the confusion that had marked his recent decline. When the last traces of supernatural illumination disappeared, leaving only the ordinary parking lot lights filtering through his window, Leo was left with the stunning realization that something impossible had just occurred. The cancer that had been systematically destroying his body was simply gone. He could feel its absence like a weight that had been lifted, a poison that had been extracted, a darkness that had been replaced by light. He sat in the quiet room for the rest of the night, watching the Virgin Mary statue and trying to process what he'd experienced. Every rational part of his mind insisted that he'd hallucinated the entire episode, that the morphine and his deteriorating condition had created a vivid dream that felt more real than reality. But his body told a different story, a story of healing that couldn't be explained by medicine or science or any framework he'd previously accepted as truth. When the morning shift arrived at 7:30, they found Leo sitting in his chair, fully dressed, alert, and apparently pain-free for the first time since his admission. The change was so dramatic that Nurse Jennifer initially thought she'd entered the wrong room. "Mr. Martinez, how are you feeling this morning?" "I feel..." Leo paused, searching for words adequate to describe his condition. "I feel like myself again. The pain is gone. Everything is different." Jennifer approached with the cautious professionalism of someone who'd seen enough terminal patients to know that apparent improvements were often followed by rapid declines. She checked his vital signs with gentle efficiency, her expression growing more puzzled with each measurement. "Your pulse is strong and regular," she reported. "Blood pressure is in the normal range. Temperature is perfect. Mr. Martinez, I need to ask, did you take any medication during the night besides what was prescribed?" "Nothing extra," Leo assured her. "The morphine pump stopped working around 3 this morning, but the pain went away anyway." Jennifer made careful notes in his chart while trying to process readings that didn't match his previous condition. "I'm going to call Dr. Patterson and ask her to come in this morning instead of waiting for her scheduled rounds this afternoon. The changes in your condition are significant enough to warrant immediate evaluation." Dr. Patterson arrived 2 hours later with the expression of someone who'd been presented with medical information that challenged her fundamental understanding of disease progression. She conducted the most thorough examination Leo had undergone since his initial diagnosis, ordering immediate blood work and requesting that the hospice's portable imaging equipment be brought to his room. "Leo," she said when the preliminary tests were complete, "I'm seeing readings that are completely inconsistent with your condition as recently as yesterday. Your white blood cell count is normal. Your liver function appears to have improved dramatically, and your pain responses suggest that whatever was causing your discomfort has resolved." "What does that mean?" Dr. Patterson looked at the Virgin Mary statue on Leo's bedside table, at the morning light falling across its carved features, at the peaceful expression that had comforted countless people over 7 decades of existence. As a woman of science, she was trained to seek rational explanations for medical phenomena. As a person of faith who'd grown up attending St. Catherine's Chapel, she was open to possibilities that science couldn't fully explain. "It means we need more comprehensive testing to understand what's happening in your body. The blood work I can do here is limited, but what I'm seeing suggests that the cancer markers we've been tracking have dropped to almost undetectable levels." The words hung in the air between them like a diagnosis in reverse, a medical verdict that contradicted everything they'd understood about Leo's condition. Dr. Patterson had been practicing medicine for 38 years, long enough to know that spontaneous remissions were extraordinarily rare, but not entirely unprecedented. She'd never personally witnessed one, but she'd read case studies and consulted with colleagues who'd encountered similar unexplained recoveries. "I want you transferred to the hospital for a complete workup," she continued. "CT scans, MRI, comprehensive, blood panels, everything we need to get a clear picture of your current condition. If what I'm seeing here is accurate, we're looking at something that will require a complete reassessment of your prognosis." Leo nodded his agreement while keeping his eyes fixed on the Virgin Mary statue. Whatever had happened during the night, whatever force had intervened in his body's systematic failure, had given him something he'd thought was lost forever: time. Time to make the phone call he'd been avoiding. Time to bridge the gap between himself and David. Time to discover whether miracles extended beyond physical healing to encompass the restoration of relationships. As the hospice staff prepared for his transfer to the hospital, Leo carefully wrapped the Virgin Mary statue in a soft towel and held it close to his chest. Whatever tests and evaluations lay ahead, whatever medical explanations or lack thereof emerged from his examination, he knew with absolute certainty that his life had been touched by something beyond the ordinary boundaries of human experience. The question now was what he was supposed to do with this unexpected gift of continued existence. The answer, he suspected, would involve courage of a different kind than what had been required to face his own mortality. It would require the bravery to reach out to his son and discover whether some miracles were meant to be shared. The envelope had been sitting in Maria's jewelry box for 3 years, sealed and yellowed, with "For Leo" written in her careful handwriting. Leo discovered it while gathering items for his transfer back home, a return journey none of the medical staff had expected when he'd been admitted 2 weeks earlier. The letter felt substantial, several pages of Maria's final thoughts. He'd avoided opening it for 3 years, partly from grief and partly from fear that her words might contain disappointments that would make mourning more difficult. Now, sitting in his old kitchen while the Virgin Mary statue watched from beside Maria's chair, Leo finally broke the seal. Her handwriting was shakier than he remembered, evidence of tremor during her final months, but her words were clear. "My dearest Leo, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're struggling with what comes next. I know you'll blame yourself for things you couldn't control, that you'll retreat into stubborn isolation, but this isn't about my dying. It's about your living. David called last week while you were at the hardware store. He wanted to know how I was really doing, not the brave version we've been presenting. I told him the truth, that I'm dying and his father needs him more than he's willing to admit. He cried on the phone, Leo. Our son cried because he loves us both and doesn't know how to bridge the distance pride has created. He asked me to give you a message, but made me promise not to say he asked. He said to tell you he's sorry about things he said when he was 18, about art school, the girl you didn't approve of, the job that took him across the country. He's sorry he wasn't here more during my illness, that he let work and fear keep him from being the son we needed. But mostly, he said he's sorry you two are so much alike that you can't find a way to say you love each other without it sounding like an argument. Leo, you have raised a good man. David has your strength and integrity, along with enough of my stubbornness to make him independent. He has a beautiful family, grandchildren you've never met because pride has kept both of you from taking the first step. I'm dying, my love, but you have years ahead if you take care of yourself. Don't waste them holding on to hurts that were never as important as the love underneath them. David is waiting for you to make the first move because he thinks his father is too proud to forgive him. You're waiting for him because you think your son is too proud to forgive you. Both of you are wrong, and both of you are right, and someone has to be brave enough to break the cycle. Call him, Leo. Tell him about the time he caught that fly ball in the championship game, about how proud you were when he graduated college, about how much you miss having him in your life. Tell him the things you've been thinking but haven't been saying. Take your troubles to the Virgin Mary statue, as I did. She has a way of listening that goes deeper than words, and sometimes she finds ways to answer that go beyond what we think possible. I love you, Leo Martinez. Love David the same way, completely, without conditions, with faith that believes in second chances. Your devoted wife, Maria. Leo read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing details he'd missed. Maria's final Gift wasn't practical advice. It was permission to reach out without losing face, a bridge she'd built between two proud men who'd forgotten how to find each other. Learning that David had called during her final weeks, expressing regret and longing for reconciliation, changed everything Leo had assumed about their estrangement. For 3 years, he'd believed David's angry funeral words represented final judgment. Discovering his son had been struggling with the same regrets and pride that had paralyzed Leo's own attempts, created an opening where none had existed. Dr. Patterson's test results had confirmed what everyone witnessed. Leo's cancer was in complete remission. Tumors visible on recent scans had vanished without trace. His blood chemistry had returned to normal ranges. The aggressive disease that should have killed him within weeks had simply disappeared. "I've been practicing medicine 38 years, Dr. Patterson had told him, and I've never seen anything like this. What happened to you defies everything we understand about pancreatic cancer progression." Leo had nodded politely while thinking about the glowing statue, about pain transformed into peace, about mysteries medical science couldn't measure or explain. Father Miguel had visited that morning to check on his transition home. Sometimes grace comes in forms we don't expect. When we most need to understand we're not facing challenges alone. Your healing is a gift, but like all gifts, it comes with opportunity to share its benefits. "I think I know what I'm supposed to do," Leo had replied. "I've known all along, but was too afraid to try." Fear of rejection is natural when reaching out to someone we've hurt or who's hurt us, but fear of leaving things unsaid should be stronger than fear of taking risks. Leo spent the afternoon preparing for the most important phone call of his life, trying to find words that could bridge 3 years of silence without dwelling on mistakes that had created it. He dialed David's number at 6:30, 9:30 in Boston, late enough that his son would be home, but early enough not to suggest emergency. The phone rang 3 times before David answered, his voice carrying cautious recognition of the caller ID. "Dad?" The single word contained 3 years of emotion, surprise, wariness, hope, fear, compressed into syllables that carried the weight of everything left unsaid since Maria's funeral. "Hello, son," Leo replied, voice steadier than expected. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "No, it's fine. Is everything okay? I mean, you never call unless—" David's voice trailed off as he realized the implications. "Everything's okay. Actually, better than okay. I've been sick, David, really sick, and I'm better now, but that's not why I'm calling." Silence stretched between them, filled with electronic hum and the weight of words both men needed to say, but weren't sure how to begin. "I found a letter your mother wrote before she died," Leo continued, choosing honesty as the path through awkwardness. "She told me about the phone call you made during her last weeks, about things you wanted me to know but were afraid to say directly." "Dad, Let me finish, please. I've been practicing this for days, and if I don't say it now, I might lose my nerve." Leo looked at the Virgin Mary statue, drawing strength from its serene expression. "I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry I was too stubborn to understand you needed to find your own path. I'm sorry I let pride keep us apart when we should have been helping each other through losing your mother. And I'm sorry it took getting sick and almost dying for me to find courage to call you." The silence that followed felt different. Someone processing words they'd been waiting years to hear, deciding whether to trust them or guard against disappointment. "I'm sorry too, Dad," David finally said, voice thick with emotion. "I said terrible things at Mom's funeral, things I didn't really mean but couldn't take back. I've been wanting to call you, especially since I heard about the earthquake, but I didn't know how to start over." Leo felt tears as years of guilt and regret began dissolving in mutual forgiveness. This was what Maria had known would happen if one of them was brave enough to make the first move. Love had been waiting underneath hurt, patience surviving despite pride, family enduring even when it seemed permanently fractured. "Can you come out here, son? I'd like to meet my grandchildren, and I have stories to tell you about miracles and second chances." I can get flights for this weekend, David replied immediately. Dad, there's so much I want to say, so much I want to share. Sarah and the kids have been asking about you, wanting to know why we never visit California. As they made plans for the reunion both had wanted but neither had dared initiate, Leo kept his eyes on the Virgin Mary statue. The carved marble seemed to reflect evening light with unusual warmth, as if approving of the conversation in its presence. The healing that began in his hospice room was expanding beyond physical recovery to encompass restoration of relationships that had seemed beyond repair. Soon, Leo would discover whether miracles had power to transform not just individuals, but entire families willing to choose forgiveness over pride. The envelope had been sitting in Maria's jewelry box for 3 years, sealed and yellowed, with "For Leo" written in her careful handwriting. Leo discovered it while gathering items for his transfer back home, a return journey none of the medical staff had expected when he'd been admitted 2 weeks earlier. The letter felt substantial, several pages of Maria's final thoughts. He'd avoided opening it for 3 years, partly from grief and partly from fear that her words might contain disappointments that would make mourning more difficult. Now, sitting in his old kitchen, while the Virgin Mary statue watched from beside Maria's chair, Leo finally broke the seal. Her handwriting was shakier than he remembered, evidence of tremor during her final months. But her words were clear. "My dearest Leo, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're struggling with what comes next. I know you'll blame yourself for things you couldn't control, that you'll retreat into stubborn isolation. But this isn't about my dying, it's about your living." David called last week while you were at the hardware store. He wanted to know how I was really doing, not the brave version we've been presenting. I told him the truth, that I'm dying and his father needs him more than he's willing to admit. He cried on the phone, Leo. Our son cried because he loves us both and doesn't know how to bridge the distance pride has created. He asked me to give you a message, but made me promise not to say he asked. He said to tell you he's sorry about things he said when he was 18, about art school, the girl you didn't approve of, the job that took him across the country. He's sorry he wasn't here more during my illness, that he let work and fear keep him from being the son we needed. But, mostly, he said he's sorry you two are so much alike that you can't find a way to say you love each other without it sounding like an argument. Leo, you have raised a good man. David has your strength and integrity, along with enough of my stubbornness to make him independent. He has a beautiful family, grandchildren you've never met because pride has kept both of you from taking the first step. I'm dying, my love, but you have years ahead if you take care of yourself. Don't waste them holding on to hurts that were never as important as the love underneath them. David is waiting for you to make the first move because he thinks his father is too proud to forgive him. You're waiting for him because you think your son is too proud to forgive you. Both of you are wrong, and both of you are right, and someone has to be brave enough to break the cycle. Call him, Leo. Tell him about the time he caught that fly ball in the championship game, about how proud you were when he graduated college, about how much you miss having him in your life. Tell him the things you've been thinking but haven't. Been saying, take your troubles to the Virgin Mary statue, as I did. She has a way of listening that goes deeper than words, and sometimes she finds ways to answer that go beyond what we think possible. I love you, Leo Martinez. Love David the same way, completely without conditions, with faith that believes in second chances. Your devoted wife, Maria. Leo read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing details he'd missed. Maria's final gift wasn't practical advice. It was permission to reach out without losing face, a bridge she'd built between 2 proud men who'd forgotten how to find each other. Learning that David had called during her final weeks, expressing regret and longing for reconciliation, changed everything Leo had assumed about their estrangement. For 3 years, he'd believed David's angry funeral words represented final judgment. Discovering his son had been struggling with the same regrets and pride that had paralyzed Leo's own attempts, created an opening where none had existed. Dr. Patterson's test results had confirmed what everyone witnessed. Leo's cancer was in complete remission. Tumors visible on recent scans had vanished without trace. His blood chemistry had returned to normal ranges. The aggressive disease that should have killed him within weeks had simply disappeared. "I've been practicing medicine 38 years, Dr. Patterson had told him, and I've never seen anything like this. What happened to you defies everything we understand about pancreatic cancer progression." Leo had nodded politely while thinking. About the glowing statue, about pain transformed into peace, about mysteries medical science couldn't measure or explain. Father Miguel had visited that morning to check on his transition home. Sometimes grace comes in forms we don't expect. When we most need to understand we're not facing challenges alone. Your healing is a gift, but like all gifts, it comes with opportunity to share its benefits. "I think I know what I'm supposed to do," Leo had replied. "I've known all along, but was too afraid to try. Fear of rejection is natural when reaching out to someone we've hurt or who's hurt us. But fear of leaving things unsaid should be stronger than fear of taking risks." Leo spent the afternoon preparing for the most important phone call of his life, trying to find words that could bridge 3 years of silence without dwelling on mistakes that had created it. He dialed David's number at 6:30, 9:30 in Boston, late enough that his son would be home, but early enough not to suggest emergency. The phone rang 3 times before David answered, his voice carrying cautious recognition of the caller ID. "Dad?" The single word contained 3 years of emotion. Surprise, wariness, hope, fear, compressed into syllables that carried the weight of everything left unsaid since Maria's funeral. "Hello, son," Leo replied, voice steadier than expected. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "No, it's fine. Is everything okay? I mean, you never call unless—" David's voice trailed off as he realized the implications. "Everything's okay. Actually, better than okay. I've been sick, David, really sick, and I'm better now. But that's not why I'm calling." Silence stretched between them, filled with electronic hum and the weight of words both men needed to say, but weren't sure how to begin. "I found a letter your mother wrote before she died," Leo continued, choosing honesty as the path through awkwardness. "She told me about the phone call you made during her last weeks, about things you wanted me to know but were afraid to say directly." "Dad, Let me finish, please. I've been practicing this for days, and if I don't say it now, I might lose my nerve." Leo looked at the Virgin Mary statue, drawing strength from its serene expression. "I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry I was too stubborn to understand you needed to find your own path. I'm sorry I let pride keep us apart when we should have been helping each other through losing your mother. And I'm sorry it took getting sick and almost dying for me to find courage to call you." The silence that followed felt different, someone processing words they'd been waiting years to hear, deciding whether to trust them or guard against disappointment. "I'm sorry too, Dad," David finally said, voice thick with emotion. "I said terrible things at Mom's funeral, things I didn't really mean, but couldn't take back. I've been wanting to call you, especially since I heard about the earthquake, but I didn't know how to start over." Leo felt tears as years of guilt and regret began dissolving in mutual forgiveness. This was what Maria had known would happen if one of them was brave enough to make the first move. Love had been waiting underneath hurt, patience surviving despite pride, family enduring even when it seemed permanently fractured. "Can you come out here, son? I'd like to meet my grandchildren, and I have stories to tell you about miracles and second chances." "I can get flights for this weekend," David replied immediately. "Dad, there's so much I want to say, so much I want to share. Sarah and the kids have been asking about you, wanting to know why we never visit California." As they made plans for the reunion both had wanted but neither had dared initiate, Leo kept his eyes on the Virgin Mary statue. The carved marble seemed to reflect evening light with unusual warmth, as if approving of the conversation in its presence. The healing that began in his hospice room was expanding beyond physical recovery to encompass restoration of relationships that had seemed beyond repair. Soon, Leo would discover whether miracles had power to transform not just individuals, but entire families willing to choose forgiveness over pride. David's plane landed Friday. Leo waited with their old baseball photo. Dad. The word felt like homecoming. They embraced. Leo saw Maria in David's eyes. During the drive home, Leo shared details about Maria's final months. Inside, David stopped. At the Virgin Mary statue. This is the statue from the earthquake? The same one your mother prayed to for 23 years. David felt warmth from the marble. There's something different. Is this connected to your recovery? I was dying. Terminal cancer, 2 weeks left. The statue glowed. Real light. The pain disappeared. Cancer gone. David stared, processing impossible. Information. Complete remission, Leo continued. I think your mother's prayers helped. I was healed for a reason. David turned with tears. I'm glad you're alive, Dad. I'm glad we get this chance. The statement opened a door between them, locked for years. David's plane landed at San Francisco International Airport on a Friday afternoon. In November, carrying with it 37 years of shared history between a father and son who had forgotten how to talk to each other without arguing. Leo waited at the arrival gate with the nervous energy of a teenager on a first date, holding a small framed photograph that had been taken at Crane Park during one of their Saturday afternoon baseball practices. The photo showed Leo in his work. Clothes, sleeves rolled up, and a patient expression on his face as he prepared to pitch another underhand ball to 10-year-old David, whose oversized glove and determined stance captured the essence of childhood optimism. Sarah had found it among David's belongings when they were packing for the trip and had suggested he bring it as a conversation starter, a bridge between the past they'd shared and the future they were hoping to rebuild. Leo recognized his son immediately, despite the 30 pounds and 15 years that had transformed the angry young man from Maria's funeral into a middle-aged father with graying temples and worry lines around his eyes. David walked with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to approach difficult situations carefully, but his face lit up with genuine warmth when he spotted Leo waiting beside the gate. Dad. The word carried the same emotional weight it had held during their phone conversation, but spoken face to face, it felt like a homecoming rather than a tentative reconnection. They embraced with the awkward enthusiasm of two people who weren't sure how much affection was appropriate after 3 years of silence, but the hug lasted long enough to communicate what words couldn't adequately express. Leo was struck by how much David resembled Maria around the eyes, the same deep brown color, the same expression of gentle intelligence that had first attracted him to his wife 44 years ago. You look good, David said, stepping back, to examine his father with the careful attention of someone who'd been expecting to find evidence of recent illness. I mean, you look really good. When you said you'd been sick, I was imagining— I know what you were imagining, Leo interrupted, gently. Same thing I would have imagined in your position. It's a long story, and most of it sounds impossible even to me, but I'm fine now. Better than fine, actually. The drive from the airport to San Rafael gave them 45 minutes to navigate. The delicate process of re-establishing a relationship that had been damaged by time and misunderstanding. They began with safe topics: David's work, designing software for financial companies, Leo's recovery from the earthquake damage to his house, the changes in San Rafael that had occurred during David's long absence. But as they approached the familiar streets where David had grown up, the conversation inevitably turned toward more personal territory. Leo found himself talking about Maria's final months, sharing details he'd kept private for 3 years because there had been no one who would understand their significance. She talked about you every day, Leo said, as they turned onto Maple Street. Even when the medication made it hard for her to remember other things, she always remembered that you were her son and that she loved you. She worried that you blamed yourself for not being here more often. I did blame myself, David admitted. I kept thinking I should have taken more time off work. Should have flown out every weekend instead of just once a month. But seeing her, getting weaker each time, watching the treatments make her so sick, it was selfish, but I couldn't handle it. I thought if I stayed away, maybe it wouldn't be real. Leo understood that kind of magical thinking, the desperate bargain-making that people do when faced with losses too large to accept. He'd done his own version of the same thing, focusing on practical details and medical logistics to avoid confronting the emotional reality of losing his wife. She understood, Leo said. Your mother was wiser about these things than either of us. She knew that love doesn't always look like presents, that sometimes caring for someone means taking care of yourself, so you can be strong when it really matters. They pulled into the driveway of the house where David had spent his childhood, where he'd learned to ride a bicycle and done homework at the kitchen table and brought friends home from school to meet his parents. The white shutters were still. White instead of the blue that Maria had always preferred. But the garden showed signs of recent care. Someone had been maintaining the flower beds and keeping the lawn trimmed. Mrs. Chen has been helping with the yard work, Leo explained, noticing David's surprise at the tidy appearance. She says it's what neighbors do for each other, but I think she just can't stand looking at an unkempt garden. Inside, the house carried the familiar sense of Leo's bachelor existence. Coffee, simple cooking, the faint mustiness that accumulates when windows aren't opened often enough. But it also held echoes of the family home it had once been, visible in the photographs still displayed on the mantelpiece and the furniture that hadn't been rearranged since Maria's death. David stopped in front of the living room table where the Virgin Mary statue occupied the place of honor beside his mother's chair. The carved marble seemed to glow in the afternoon light, streaming through the windows, creating an almost ethereal presence that drew immediate attention. "This is the statue from the earthquake?" David asked, approaching it with the reverence of someone who understood its significance in his family's history. "The same one your mother prayed to every Sunday for 23 years, Leo confirmed. "I couldn't leave it buried in the rubble. Seemed like abandoning part of her memory." David reached out tentatively, not quite touching the statue but holding his hand close enough to feel the warmth that seemed to emanate from the marble. "There's something different about it. I mean, I remember it from when I was a kid, but this feels, I don't know how to describe it. Blessed, maybe. Changed by all the prayers it's heard over the years." Leo settled into his usual chair, watching his son's reaction to the statue that had become such an important part of his own daily routine. "Your mother always said it had a way of listening that went deeper than words. Is this connected to your recovery? The healing you mentioned on the phone?" Leo had been dreading this question. Not because he was unwilling to share the truth, but because the truth sounded impossible even to him. How did you explain supernatural intervention to a son who worked with computers and lived in a world governed by logic and measurable outcomes? "I was dying, David. Terminal pancreatic cancer, maybe 2 weeks left to live. I was in hospice, making peace with the idea that I'd never get the chance to talk to you again." Leo's voice grew quieter as he recounted the most difficult period of his life. "And then, one night, the statue began to glow. Real light, not imagination or medication effects. The pain disappeared completely, and when they tested me the next morning, the cancer was gone." David stared at his father with the expression of someone trying to process information that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the world worked. As a software engineer, he was trained to identify logical problems and systematic solutions. Miracles didn't fit into that framework, but the evidence of his father's health was undeniable. The doctors confirmed this. They have medical records showing the cancer disappeared. Complete remission. Dr. Patterson says she's never seen anything like it in 38 years of practice. Leo looked at the Virgin Mary statue, remembering the moment when impossible became reality. "I know how it sounds. If someone had told me the same story a month ago, I would have assumed they were confused or lying. But I was there, David. I felt the healing happen." "And you think the statue caused it?" I think your mother's prayers had something to do with it. I think sometimes faith creates possibilities that science can't explain or measure, and I think I was healed for a reason that goes beyond my own survival." David spent several minutes in contemplative silence, studying the statue and processing his father's account of events that defied rational explanation. Finally, he turned back to Leo with tears in his eyes. "I'm glad you're alive, Dad. I'm glad we get this chance to fix things between us. However it happened, whatever made it possible, I'm grateful." The simple statement of gratitude opened a door between them that had been locked for years, creating space for the kind of honest conversation that could heal old wounds and build new understanding. For the first time since David's arrival, Leo felt confident that their reunion would accomplish what both of them had hoped, but neither had dared to expect. 6 months later, Leo Martinez stood in his garden, teaching grandson Michael how to oil a baseball glove, while 8-year-old Emma painted watercolor flowers that had finally returned after years of neglect. The late spring sunshine felt different on his face, warmer, more precious, filtered through gratitude that came with understanding how close he'd come to losing everything. The Virgin Mary statue now resided in David's new home, 12 blocks away, where his son had relocated his family after deciding some distances were too great to maintain. The carved marble sat on a small altar Sarah had created. Surrounded by 3 generations of photographs and fresh flowers, Emma replaced every Sunday with the same devotion her grandmother had once shown. "Like this, Grandpa?" Michael asked, working leather conditioner into his glove with serious 10-year-old attention. The glove was new, a gift from Leo, but the ritual of caring for it was timeless. "Perfect," Leo assured him, remembering similar afternoons when David had been the same age. "Your dad learned to do that exact same thing when he was your age, sitting in this same spot. Did you teach him everything you're teaching me?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, touching on legacy and continuity restored through forgiveness. Leo considered his answer carefully. "I taught him what I could," Leo said finally, "but I didn't always know what the most important lessons were. Sometimes we have to learn things the hard way before we can pass them on properly." Emma looked up from her painting. "Is that why you and Daddy didn't talk for so long? Because you were still learning important lessons?" Children had a way of cutting through adult complexity to reach difficult truths. "That's exactly right," Leo replied. "Your daddy and I both needed to learn that saying I'm sorry isn't the same as being weak, and that asking for forgiveness takes more courage than staying angry." David emerged from the house carrying lemonade and sandwiches, sleeves rolled up, and expression relaxed in a way that suggested he'd found peace with both past and present. The move to California had been good professionally, but the real transformation had been personal. Restoration of family connections that had given him back parts of himself he'd forgotten were missing. "Mom called this morning," David announced, settling beside his father. "She says the new chapel is almost finished, and they want you there for the dedication ceremony. Father Rodriguez specifically requested you for the altar blessing." The rebuilding of St. Catherine's Chapel had been a community effort taking nearly a year. The new structure honored the original's architectural style while incorporating modern safety features. Local families had contributed everything from donations to volunteer labor, united by desire to restore their spiritual center. Leo's role had gone beyond symbolic value of his statue rescue. His miraculous recovery had become part of the parish's story, inspiring faith and hope across denominational boundaries. People from across the region had visited, drawn by accounts of divine intervention that offered comfort to those facing their own struggles. "I'd be honored to attend," Leo said, though public recognition still made him uncomfortable. The afternoons settled around them, with particular contentment that comes from family gatherings where everyone understands how precious and fragile their time together really is. Michael practiced his swing while Leo offered gentle corrections. Emma added finishing touches to her painting while humming the same Mexican lullaby Maria used to sing. David and Sarah discussed practical matters with easy intimacy of couples who'd learned to prioritize relationships over individual ambitions. As evening approached, Leo found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The earthquake that had seemed like pure destruction had actually been the beginning of restoration. The cancer that should have ended his life had instead provided catalyst for healing extending far beyond physical recovery. The estrangement that had felt permanent had dissolved in the presence of love, waiting patiently for pride to step aside. The Virgin Mary statue, now in David's home, offering quiet blessing to a new generation, had taught Leo that miracles weren't always about changing circumstances. Sometimes they were about changing hearts, providing courage to reach across distances that seemed too great to bridge, believing that some forms of love were stronger than fear or regret or stubborn pride. As they sat down to dinner at the table where Maria had once served thousands of meals, Leo offered simple prayer of gratitude for second chances, for healing encompassing more than physical recovery, and for understanding that some blessings were meant to be shared across generations. Outside, the San Rafael Hills settled into twilight, and Leo Martinez faced the future with his family beside him, his health restored, and his faith renewed in possibilities that transcended boundaries of what seemed reasonable or likely. Some stories were too important to end with death, too powerful to be defeated by pride, too beautiful to be contained within limits of ordinary experience. This was one of those stories, and it was still being written.